Everyone, in this video lecture, we are going to be talking all about ATP energy. All right, before we can talk about ATP, we need to just have a general understanding of what is energy. So, if we were to define energy in the sciencey way, we're talking about energy is the ability to do work. And when we hear the term work, we think, oh, a job or like homework that we have to do. Well, in this case, work is referring to things that are occurring in cells, such as movement. So, movement is a type of work. Energy is needed for movement. Transporting things across the cell membrane. We've seen that active transport is a type of movement of molecules through the cell membrane that needs energy, as well as protein synthesis is a very energy intensive process. So, energy is necessary in order to accomplish these tasks. So, the question is, where do we get this energy from in order to perform these different tasks? So, all living things need carbohydrates. When we talked about our biomolecules, we talked about carbs as being a form of short term energy. And the majority of the type of carbs that we want is in the form of glucose, which is a very simple sugar ring. And the reason we need glucose, that type of carbohydrate, is it will enter our mitochondria of our cells, and the mitochondria is going to use a process called cellular respiration to convert that glucose into ATP energy molecules. So, we're going to talk about ATP and how it actually is able to provide energy for the cell. In future lessons, you will learn about how glucose is actually converted into ATP via this process called cellular respiration. So, one thing I do want to point out though is, where do organisms get those carbohydrates that they need in order to make ATP? So, all living things can be classified as either autotrophs or heterotrophs, depending on where they get their carbs. So, autotrophs, auto, think of the term self, auto means self. Troph in Latin means food or feeding. So, autotrophs feed themselves. So they are able to make their own carbs using energy from the sun. They absorb sunlight and are able to take in some other molecules and convert those molecules into glucose. Whereas heterotrophs, hetero in Latin means different. So these are organisms that eat different or other organisms that already contain those carbohydrates. So these are how different organisms get their carbs in order to make ATP. So, ATP, what this stands for, it's an acronym that stands for adenosine triphosphate. So, adenosine is a nucleotide that makes up DNA. It is the A nucleotide. It also has three phosphate groups attached to it, which is why we call it a triphosphate. And how this molecule actually provides energy in the cell is that it has these three phosphate groups attached, and the bonds that hold each of these groups together contains lots of energy stored up inside them. Okay, that bond holding those phosphates together, especially the last bond between the last two phosphates, has lots and lots of energy stored inside of it. Well, if that bond is broken and we break off that third phosphate, energy gets released. And now the cell can use that energy for movement, for transport, etc., etc. So now we have a new molecule that's left over. So we have this free little phosphate all by itself. Now we have this remaining molecule that we call ADP. So, what do we think the D in ADP stands for if before this molecule was ATP and had three phosphates? The D stands for diphosphate. Di means two. So, this molecule only has two phosphates left to it. So, how this all works is that ATP is constantly being generated and used and then regenerated. This is a cycle that is able to recycle itself throughout a cell. So you have your ATP molecule that you've created from cellular respiration, from eating some carbs that contain glucose. Well, now your cell wants to use that ATP, so it's going to crack off that last phosphate, releasing energy to be used by the cell. That leaves behind ADP, the molecule that only has two phosphates, so it's a diphosphate. Well, these little free phosphates that get broken off, they're floating around the cell. So if you have ADP and you have a free little phosphate all by itself, ADP can combine with that free phosphate, forming ATP again. So this is a cycle that is constantly going to keep happening where the bond breaks off, releasing energy, then we can form a bond, storing that energy back up. So ATP is recyclable. We can constantly regenerate it even if we are not actually consuming carbs like glucose.